on this next session, I think we'll do a little bit of a sum up of the pillars with the risk management pillar. So looking forward to discussing that with you, and I will just share my screen. Just bring this up. And here we go. So, as I mentioned yesterday, I think risk management in some ways is a relatively broad topic, and one that kind of encapsulates the whole TCFD. So while it is its own pillar, I think it has adjacencies in terms of needing metrics and targets to effectively manage risk, having good policies and procedures from governance to enforce risk management practices, knowing where your risk appetite is and how that affects decisions you make, which relates to strategy. So I think in risk management, this is where it all comes together and where it fits. And what I would say on that is we can start first by exploring some of the risk management frameworks, and then we can jump into a bit of the climate risk tools and methodologies that can be used for managing risk. We'll talk a little bit about the UNEP-FI methodologies on physical and transition risk that have been developed with our partners. And then we can also cover the topics of good practices. I put those good practices at the end to sort of front load us on the implementation side rather than the disclosure side. But I think the goal is to really understand what some of these analytical methods are for risk management, think about what constitutes good practice, and then learn about how these tools can be applied. And within risk management, there are three main disclosures. One is on risk identification, one is on management, and then one is more broad, kind of spanning identifying, assessing, and managing. And I tend to think of those as the three stages of risk management: risk identification, risk assessment, and risk management. And often then a kind of related fourth stage is disclosure. So disclosing all of those, what you are doing, what you found, and what the scale of the problem is. And the middle piece of this session will focus more on the area of assessment, which I think is an important one, but will also be one that I think is necessary to understand both the identification side as well as the management side, because what goes into those assessments depends on what areas of material risk you've identified, and what comes out in terms of disclosures relates to what sort of data you have, what type of tools you're using in order to conduct that analysis. And so how you manage that risk will also be informed by what you find in the assessments. To start off, I think that risk management, when it comes to climate, really is something that runs the gamut across the entire organization from top to bottom. And that means starting at the board level, starting at the management level. And what are those leaders to do? Well, they're the ones that are responsible for setting overall goals. They're the ones that are responsible for developing a risk appetite and also incorporating climate into that. How does climate change or otherwise inform the risk appetite? Also, on the next point, the impact of climate strategy and governance. So what is the strategy for making these changes, and how will they get pushed down? What are the policies and procedures that will happen? So not so different from what we talked about yesterday on the governance side. I see the climate risk function as kind of a glue, and that may be a designated organization, a designated function within the team, or it may instead be a group of individuals across different divisions or different departments. But fundamentally, these are the people that are taking information from the business lines, that are conducting the identification and analysis, and providing the necessary reports internally to inform decision-making at a senior level, but also externally to issue reports like the TCFD. And so climate risk is right in the middle of this pyramid, both looking up toward what are the key takeaways from the board, and looking to the business at the ground level of what are their actions and how are those either creating or mitigating climate risks. Then, and business is not the bottom, but rather the base of the pyramid, because fundamentally everything stands on the commercial activities, and all of the pieces that support them and instruct them and guide them are ones that need to make sure that their analysis, their insights, their policies get down to the business level. With a failure to implement at a business level, then what you're left with are just a bunch of policies and a bunch of reports without any real action. And so at the business line, these are the people that will know the most about the clients, will know the most about the activities either directly undertaken or undertaken by clients that may pose climate risks. So it's an effective way to maintain a strong set of climate data by having business knowledgeable as well as informed about the particular impacts of climate on their work. Also, good data and good processes begin with the business. What are the policies that are put in place, whether underwriting, whether new business strategy? Who are the ones deploying it? That is going to be at the business line as well. And so to operationalize some of the strategy, to act on some of the insights from the climate risk function, that will come down to the business. And more than that, the business also will feed up some of that data, some of those insights and information, and in many cases provide a useful sense check on how various clients or various industries are being impacted by climate. It's not that they need to be climate experts, but it's a combination of taking climate knowledge and taking understanding of a particular segment, sector, or client, and putting those together to get a full profile. As I've said previously, climate risk doesn't stand outside of the other types of risks, but rather is a contributing factor to market risk, to credit risk, to operational risk. And so it's not just enough to take that risk independently, but to think about how it relates to the other already extant risks that are being captured and being covered. So with that structure in mind, I think it's useful to think a little bit about what this framework can and potentially should look like within your institution. So one of the big recommendations is that I wouldn't suggest people go about just rebuilding their risk framework or building a parallel climate risk framework. Again, as I said, the goal is not to have climate risk siloed and covered, but the goal is to have it well integrated. And so what that means is often there are upgrades necessary to existing existing risk management frameworks. But if you have a sound risk management process, it is one that should be enhanced to include climate rather than rebuilt or built in parallel. As you likely know, if you think, and I back from my consulting days, have taken this slide of the sort of risk house, as we like to call it, starting with risk appetite, and then going down to organization and governance, the business layer, and then specifically action items of risk ID, as we talked about, risk mitigation, which is sort of the risk management piece, and then data and external reporting, which again is that disclosure item that I had mentioned previously. And so a framework should be comprehensive in covering each of these items, but the question is, where does climate fit into each of these? And the idea is that a climate risk management framework should exist as part of each of these items of this house. And so I think the starting point is to see where climate already comes in and where the impacts of climate from climate risk analyses are being generated, but don't yet come into the process. So if we flow through, can we say, is risk appetite taking into account climate? Yes or no? Is risk governance taking into account climate? Yes or no? Are climate principles being explored and taken out at the business line? Yes or no? And I think from there we begin to get a sense of what the specific challenges are that are going to be faced by a given institution. And I think that one of the big points is that we see within these risk frameworks an opportunity for better integration, but also an opportunity to learn from peers and learn from regulatory guidance. So as more and more guidance is coming out, say, around climate risk disclosures, I think this is an opportunity for us to really speak about the specifics of what is expected in that external reporting that can be codified and explored. Likewise, as tool use advances and knowledge of those particular tools becomes more prominent, we can think about what our procedures and policies are. So in many ways, some of these risk implementation steps are ones that need something concrete to refer to. So it's nice to kind of build the house, but then the question is, how do industry good practices, internal good practices, and regulatory mandates fit into each of these boxes? And I think that's really the next step that makes this a concrete exercise rather than a more abstract brainstorming activity. So before I go on to some of the tools and methodologies used for risk assessment, just any thoughts or questions around the risk management framework, the degree of integration at your own institutions, things that you're seeing that you'd like to cover. But yeah, just obviously glad to take a moment for questions. Otherwise, we can move to the next section. So I'm not going to go through every single tool that is in the marketplace today for climate risk assessment. There are just too many. And in some ways, that is my first message here, which is there are a lot of options around climate risk assessment. And I think that that's great. It shows that the market is increasingly maturing. It shows that there's a real eagerness to tackle this issue, both on the part of corporations and financial institutions, as well as data and methodology providers. And one of the things that we did was a few years ago, we wrote a report on investor work in climate called Changing Course. And we did a bit of a landscape of who are the major players in climate risk landscape. Let's go back to them and now see how that has changed. And as I mentioned, in that period of time, we've seen a proliferation of new methodologies, new tools, and new approaches. And I'll talk about some of those decision points in our conversation. But I would also mention that there's this paper that we released earlier this year called The Climate Risk Landscape that looks at both the physical and transition sides of climate risk and provides some thoughts on what the particular tool providers look like, what their coverage is, and what some of their strengths are. But just a few big takeaways from this paper. Big takeaways are, as I said, the regulatory requirements and the interest in this topic is driving new approaches and new market entrants. There's also, though, more of a common underlying data, and that might be in the sense of physical risk data coming from a given source, whether those are representative concentration pathways from the IPCC, or now scenario pathways from the Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS. The other point is that there is more integration going on, or more thinking about how physical and transition risk layer onto each other. What are the next steps in this process? What are the next things that need to happen to add to development and to drive these things forward? Those are all important steps that are going on in the process, which is to see more integration, to see greater granularity, to see more geographic coverage, and to see new uses of applications. I was actually just on a webinar talking about the role of artificial intelligence, AI, in climate risk and climate data. And I think that there is a growing role in any complex system for these new types of data and analytical techniques. So in the report, we, as I said, we cover transition risks and physical risks, and I'll just go through some of the things we found and then circle up on any questions you might have about some of the providers, about some of the things that exist, don't exist, are still limitations. And then, as I said, we'll sort of use the worked example of UNEP-FI's methodologies developed in conjunction with our partners to share a bit of what these may look like in a bit more detail. So on the transition risk side, I think one of the defining questions is a top-down or bottom-up structure. A top-down structure is one that starts with the scenario and produces estimates and time series for financial impacts that start based on the scenario variables themselves and apply them in some sort of way to the individual portfolio companies. On the other hand, you can do bottom-up analysis, looking at the idiosyncrasies of each counterparty and thinking about what the impacts will be. Often you can see approaches that are combinations of these, where maybe there's a sampling approach that's bottom-up and an overall view that is top-down. That's actually the UNEP-FI approach. Or other times you'll see two separate approaches. So for the PRA's climate stress test, this is an example where there's both top-down and bottom-up structure. The top-down structure is the structure of the scenarios that are provided by the PRA, and the bottom-up structure is the assessment of individual counterparties by them. Another thought on the transition side is, what are the drivers? Are they purely economic? So how does profitability change within a sector? Or are there more policy nuances that are added in? What happens in the case of a trade war? What happens in the case of a dual attempted transition and physical risk damages together? These are questions that we've been taking up with the National Institutes of Economic and Social Research in the UK, and some of the work that we're aiming to do there is to think about what some of those shorter term impacts could look like. But ultimately, the desire is, as I've said yesterday, fundamentally a translation exercise, translating from the outputs of the physical risk models into impact channels, the outputs from socioeconomic models called integrated assessment models that we talked about yesterday on the scenario side, into financially relevant variables and impacts. And so you can see some of these levels can be relatively granular at the firm level or the asset level even, or at a higher level, just related to country macroeconomic factors or even regional macroeconomic factors. On the physical side, the work is a little bit different because rather than thinking about a limited number of transmission channels and a limited number of drivers, you have a higher number of hazards. And one of the areas of increasing complexity is in the multi-hazard evaluation. So that means looking at how multiple hazards interact and intersect. And a lot of the nonlinear results of damages can be a flood with high winds coming that either blows more water in or causes damage to structures. A fire with additionally a heat wave to put added load on the grid or on the system. So one of the big questions is what hazards are covered by a given tool? And within that, understanding what hazards are covered by a given tool, the next question is what scenarios are going to be runnable for those hazards? And in many cases, those scenarios are ones that are tied to the IPCC's reference scenarios of representative concentration pathways. These are the emissions pathways that look at strong mitigation, moderate mitigation, low mitigation, and a continuing rise in emissions. So looking at physical hazards under those different conditions and how they fit together, I think, is the more complex and the more sophisticated way to assess these types of risks. In the report, there's a lot of different opportunities to see how different tool providers cover these different features. There's also an opportunity to see the granularity of their assessments, and furthermore, an opportunity to see what type of assets they look to cover. Are they covering physical assets? Are they covering securities? Are they integrated with physical and transition risks together? There are really a number of opportunities to put these pieces together in order to evaluate physical risk. And so in our UNEP-FI pilot, what we've been working on is working with a number of these physical and transition tool providers to have them do an assessment of each institution will do a demo and then provide a bit of a write-up on their experience doing that demo, with the purpose of putting this in an anthology for us to explore and for us to share around with those who are looking to understand coverage within these tools. Just to say a few more words before jumping into any questions you have about tools more generally. What I would say is, in terms of areas of progression, we've seen, as I said, a lot of advancement in the data used. We've seen a lot of new providers enter the space. Integration between physical and transition risk is a big advance. On the transition side, increasing use of net zero scenarios and or 1.5 degree scenarios has been important. On the physical side, the use of multi-hazard models has been a big trend. And yet at the same time, there are still model limitations, which are going to be challenging, and ones that anyone who is using one of these models should still go in eyes open to recognize these challenges and to appreciate that they're not just so straightforward that I'm using this as a plug and play, but I really need to make some of my own assumptions and recognize where the modeling story ends and where the work that we need to do begins. And so you have information typically that is stronger for listed companies rather than SMEs, or rather than at the asset level. You have for supply chains often simplified dynamics for this sector. These are the dependencies, and this is how the model relates them. As mentioned, risks for unlisted companies tend to be a relatively weaker area of coverage, as do questions of adaptation and resiliency. And again, at the counterparty level, levels of engagements. Same with things like intangible assets. So these last three really have big impacts on the value and damages faced by a given counterparty, but aren't typically taken into most models. And as a result, what you have is the case where most of the asset level modeling is relatively static. And so while geographically you can do some very impressive things with how granular your scenarios are, if you're not going to take into account the degree of resilience measures that a institution is doing, or ways that your engagement with them could change their future policies, then you're certainly missing a good part of the story. I don't think anyone expects that everything will be the same in 2050 as it is today. And yet at the same time, it's still illuminative to look at these counterparties as static and see how they would change from your current portfolio and what actions then must be taken to avert that change unfolding as it does. So let me stop there. As I said, with the climate risk landscape, there's a number of tools that are in there. There's a number of comparisons. Interested to hear any questions on some of the existing climate tools before we go on to exploring and explaining some of this methodology. Any tool-related questions? Otherwise, we can go into a bit of the methodology itself, and I think that would be helpful to just explain a few examples of what this methodology looks like and what it does. And so, just to walk through both UNEP-FI's transition risk methodology as well as its physical risk methodology, I think these are helpful ways for you to just see what some of these approaches look like in practice and begin thinking about what sort of approaches you would want to design, as well as what questions you have about conducting the type of scenario analysis mentioned here. So with UNEP-FI's transition risk methodology, this was something we had developed with Oliver Wyman. It was something that we had worked on with a group of 16 banks back in 2018 and then into 2019. And the idea here is really to take the best scientific-based information from the scenarios and then apply that to the portfolio. But recognizing from what I said before that that's just a top-down implementation, it becomes necessary also to think about the unique and idiosyncratic features of your own portfolio. And yet, how do we balance those things? Well, we don't want to have an onerous process of having to calibrate every borrower. And we also don't want to have a just generalized process of assuming everyone in a sector behaves the same. So how can we use the borrowers to give us some sort of individualization or distinction? And so the idea here is that we take the scenarios, we translate them into financial drivers of risk. And then we look at, for the individual borrowers, what sort of protective or potentially damaging features they're likely to experience under a climate transition. And from there, then we're able to significantly improve our ability to assess those risks by extrapolation. And so the next page gives a little bit of how this methodology functions in practice, which is to say, we start with scenario models. So these are models from the Network on Greening the Financial System, models like the IEA. We take those models and then we say, okay, first step is to develop a view on how costs and revenues within a sector may be impacted by the scenario. So we would split this out into different sectors and different regions. So maybe we're looking at oil and gas in Europe. And then within there, we would say, how are the costs to oil and gas going to change under the scenario? How are the revenues going to change under the scenario? And the cost, we would look at variables like the carbon price. We would look at variables like total emissions from the oil and gas sector in Europe. On the revenue side, we would look at the price of oil as well as the amount of oil demand that exists. And ultimately, by looking at those, we can begin to get a indicative degree of financial pressure on a given sector. Then what we could say is recognizing that even though these scenarios provide us a lot of detail, they maybe don't provide us as nuanced a view as we'd like. So what we can do is do a heat mapping exercise where we say for these different risk drivers, or what we call risk factor pathways, we can think about which segments within a sector are most exposed. So for example, if you have the automotive sector and you're looking at internal combustion and you're looking at electric vehicles as your two sectors, electric vehicles, due to their lack of emissions during their operating life, will have much lower direct emissions costs than internal combustion engines. In terms of revenue, if there's a big shift toward EVs, you'll see positive revenue for them relative to the baseline case. And if you don't see a lot of EVs, if you see internal combustion, then you may see revenues fall as EVs become more prevalent. And so that gives us what we would call a segment. And so that segment is based on both the variables coming out of the model, as well as our judgment about how, for that given sector, there are variable pockets of companies. Then within each of those segments, we look at different borrowers and we say, under the data that we've been given from this scenario, how would we re-rate the borrower based on their rating now? Or how would we, in this case, if it's an asset, how would we change the value of that asset now? And we do this for a small number of borrowers or a small number of assets. And from there, we're able to use the shift in their ratings coupled with the points on sensitivity and risk drivers that we mentioned before in order to put those together in terms of in terms of the overall climate impact. So we say, okay, well, they already had this level of performance, and now once we've added these in, we have significantly higher impact, because due to climate, we don't just need to consider the well-being of this company, but we also need to consider the additional damages that will be brought by a carbon tax on the transition side, and that's one of the main findings, is to say, okay, if we take these individual borrowers and we look at how much they shift in a given scenario based on our internal ratings model, we can then also look at the broader story of how do revenues and costs change within the industry overall, and put those two pieces together to kind of get a portfolio level perspective on where damages are likely to be and how big those damages are. So it's, as I said, kind of a combination of top-down and bottom-up thinking that brings this together. The next example is on the physical risk side. And similarly, this is going to take physical risk data. So it won't take the NGFS scenarios per se, but it will take physical data, say from the NGFS or from others, and it will look at under different representative concentration pathways, those futures that I told you, strong mitigation, moderate mitigation, low mitigation, and continuing rising emissions, and look at how the physical damages for different hazards will change over time. And the two things that this approach looks at are, how does the baseline change? So you've probably seen in the recent news about the heat waves in the Pacific Northwest, that while that those temperatures were much less likely without climate change. That's definitely the case, and it's definitely an important point to note, but it's also the case that that type of attribution analysis, that type of work is able to be done because what it's really doing is assessing the effects on a changing baseline. Essentially, how much more likely do events become because the baseline itself has shifted? And so the idea being that if a world is 2 degrees warmer, the heat wave may not be 2 degrees warmer, it may be 5 degrees warmer, because if you look at a distribution, the likelihood that you are already way out on the tail is relatively low. So if you shift that distribution over and you bring more of the tail into the fat part of the distribution, many of those more extreme values that were very unlikely become significantly more likely. So that's the incremental changes in climate. Then you also have extreme events that they themselves become more frequent and can become more damaging. And the way we tried to apply this was we looked at a sample of borrowers again, either real properties or within the agricultural space. And then we looked at the specific events and through literature, the correlation of those events or impacts with the changes in property value in the property case, or changes in agricultural yields in the agriculture case. But essentially the idea there was look at the historical damages of certain extreme events and then shift their likelihoods, severities, and probabilities based on this changing baseline. And from there say, okay, if the relationship between a 1 in 100-year flood and damages tends to be 10 to 15%, can we use that to talk about a restatement of property values? Or if there's an expectation that productivity is likely to grow independent of climate, well, how much of a drag on that productivity then would climate be? How much faster would things have grown had we not had these negative impacts from climate? And so fundamentally, this exercise is bringing together both the incremental component and the extreme event component in order to make that distinction and that assessment. The next and last of these pieces is on specifically the work done in the investor program with Carbon Delta, now part of MSCI, on impacts on impact assessments for investor portfolios. And the idea here was to think about how valuations change based on the specifics of a given scenario. So first asking the question, what are the impacts of different events? And so this is not so different than what you saw on the prior page. What do those historical impacts tend to be? Then if we apply those to financial statements of a particular company, how can we revalue that company based on its new financials? And then finally, can we take that information and look at, based on the holdings in a portfolio, which companies were most affected, and from there get a sense of what those total damages would be. So before I go into good practices, I'm interested to just hear any questions or comments. I can spend a bit more time on the methodology. The focus here, of course, is not to do a live fire demonstration, but obviously to provide you with some context and background on the specifics of the approaches UNEP-FI did, just so you can see some of the trade-offs and benefits of the different approaches. Any questions? So in terms of risk management disclosures, as I mentioned, I think that there's a three-step process to management of identification, then assessment, and then risk management. And from there, what that means is that making those assessments is really a first step. And that's where exercises like heat mapping, which we'll talk about a little bit in the steps to come, but where heat mapping and risk identification exercises are going to be particularly valuable. Next, there's the recognition that that we need to think about what frameworks are being used internally as well as across the industry for that risk identification process. And then one of the newer pieces to this is in identifying and assessing risks. Before we get into some of those deeper assessments, those tools I just talked about, we can also do a materiality assessment. So what are the material risks? We could also do a green versus non-green assessment, looking at what in the portfolio meets a given standard, whether that's a Paris-aligned benchmark or whether that's the EU's green taxonomy. And then the question from there is, once these risks have been identified and assessed, how can their insights be gathered up and reported both in a comprehensive way to supervisors, but also used as a way to develop various strategies. A good example here from the UBS sustainability report last year looks at different sectors and looks specifically at exposures. And so they've published this publicly, showing what those exposures are, but also which of those they've deemed high risk. And so you can see, of all the total exposures, the high risk or climate sensitive ones are ones that make up a little bit over 13% of the total. You can see 38,700 over 283 at the bottom. But the idea here is not everything will be climate impacted, but knowing where the perimeter of your climate exercise is a valuable thing to do. And so in this case, that has been broken out explicitly, and then the various categories used have been defined based on some of the key criteria of what specifically is an important metric, as well as what sector is a climate sensitive one. Then the next piece, as I said, after assessment, gets into management as well. And I think good climate risk management ties very closely into risk assessment, in the sense that good practice really does lean on, in a large way, lean on the development of linkages between risk ID processes and assessments, because without that information, without a identification of priorities, without an assessment of quantification and magnitude, management is flying blind. And so that's why risk management has such an important role to play, along with metrics and targets, in the quantification of this work. Because when we're looking to manage these risks, there's an important way to think about how big are the risks indeed, what is the scale or scope of those exposures, and then from there, what are the actions you're going to take in order to measure or manage them. And so while somebody may be really interested in the details, somebody else may actually just want to understand, what are you doing about the risks you face? And so in the managing risk section, the risk identification is useful to describe, but the key is that once risks are described, then they are adequately assessed, and not only are they assessed, but also good risk management practices are put in place in order to avoid future incidences of either new risk exposure or incidences of overlooking a particular material risk. This report from Barclays, I think, does a helpful job of covering some of the points on those risk types. As I said, climate risk shouldn't sit in a silo. It should be well connected to the other risk types, to credit risks, to market risks, and in this case, treasury and capital risks, more of a liquidity risk, and then op risk. And what is helpful here is understanding what the risk is, what the time period covered would be, and then how the assessments have been conducted and what has been learned from them. So what are the main takeaways of climate's influence on credit risk? What are the main takeaways of climate's influence on market risk? And then even if there are big steps necessary to address some of those challenges, then at least they are classified in a way that allows you to dive into, oh, this is related to credit risk, or oh, this is related to market risk, rather than to just try to kind of keep track of all the potential ways in which climate can affect your portfolio. It's helpful to think about them over different horizons, but with different partners and also across different risks. The final piece of risk management is about integration. And I'd like to spend a little bit of time and also hear some of your thoughts when we get to the questions in the poll about this, which is to say, for risk management, one of the big points is that, as I've said, this shouldn't stand alone. This should be well integrated into these different risk types that you see at the top here. And the way that works is, as mentioned yesterday, understanding what policies and procedures need to be developed. In your conversation with Alex, this question of KPIs and key risk indicators, what is being reported at the business level, as well as up to executives about the overall portfolios. Then I think it's necessary to think about within each of these risk reports and risk reporting, where does climate fit? How is it currently being taken into account? And then ultimately, what are the actionable policies that are needed and necessary to undergo a mitigation effort and to help minimize and mitigate the climate risks that are presently faced? And so because of that, any types of clear policy guidance is going to be important for integration, as is any sort of analysis or data collection that will give you insights into the levels of climate risk. But the point is, these shouldn't be siloed, but should be integrated into overall financial statements. So this shouldn't be, what are your losses X climate, but rather, how does climate feed into your losses? And in an attribution analysis, what components of those losses directly depend on the climate scenario that is developed? So again, using this same report, because I think it's a helpful one to look at, you can see how this framework looks, the different risk types that were mentioned previously, but then clearly delineated responsibilities. So on reputational risks, thinking about specific controls and what the relationships are. On credit risk, looking at exposures and what some of the largest counterparties are and their potential exposures. On the market risk side, these responsibilities are running stress scenarios to see how markets change in response to climate action. And then in terms of treasury management and treasury risk, thinking about questions of what are the steps that have impacts on internal capital adequacy or liquidity adequacy, and ensuring that that is in keeping with liquidity requirements as well as capital requirements for the firm. So ultimately, and you can see similarly on operational risk, similar to reputational risk, you have this coverage, but it's important that there is clearly defined ownership and connected and integrated approaches across the different risk types. So now we've arrived at the end of the 4 pillars. As I said, the next session will cover the specifics of scenarios, and I think that will be an expansion of some of the conversations we had yesterday. What are these scenarios telling us? What are the new scenarios? How are they different from prior ones that had been previously created? So we'll spend some time there.